Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Oorala Centre. My name is Guido Posthausen. I'm the acting director here at the centre. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today. I'd just like to commence by an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the Inuit people who are the traditional custodians of this land we meet on today, and I pay my respect to the elders past and present. So welcome to today's seminar presentation by Caitlin Davey, The Interplay Between Prejudice and Punitive Attitudes and its impact on Aboriginal and Torres Australians. Caitlin is a Biripi woman from northern north coast of New South Wales, and she is a research associate at the University Centre for Rural Criminology and a current PhD student. And Caitlin has a background in criminology and psychological science with first-hand experience working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians involved in the criminal justice system. Today, Caitlin will discuss the findings from a representative survey of the Australian public and examine the relationship between prejudice, lay theories of race, minority threat, and punitive attitudes. At the end of Caitlin's presentation, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. And can I just ask anyone joining us online to please mute themselves? And please join me now in welcoming Caitlin to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks, Guido. I thought I would start today's presentation by talking a little bit about myself and my background before diving right into my paper. So Guido kind of took everything I wanted to say, but I'll just reiterate it. So I have a background of psychological sciences. I finished my bachelor's degree in that in 2018. And then I went on to do my postgraduate diploma in 2019. I then backed that up in 2020 by completing my Bachelor of Criminology, and then started my PhD in 2021. Throughout my entire study journey, I actually worked in the criminal justice system. So I was in and out of different positions within prisons across Victoria and Queensland. And I also worked in the parole space as well. While I was in those types of roles, I really worked with high risk offenders, many of which were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. And because of that, that really drove that passion that I have for being able to advocate for my people that have those types of experiences. Then when I went into my PhD, it only made sense that these were the types of things I wanted to look at and research a bit further. So as Guido said, I'm a Biripi woman from the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and my PhD is by publication, and I'll talk a little bit through what my PhD looks like more broadly in just a second. But today, my presentation is entitled The Interplay Between Prejudice and Punitive Attitudes and its Impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. So just for some broader context, this is a breakdown of the 4 studies that I'll be doing throughout my PhD. So firstly, I did a quantitative study where I looked at punitive attitudes and its predictors. So that's things like political ideology, media consumption, those types of things. My second study, which I'm presenting today, really honed in on those more race-based factors and how they might relate to punitive attitudes. My third study, which I haven't done yet, but I'm in the process of doing that at the moment, will look at the same race-based factors and punitive attitudes, but really look at the divide between the urban context and the rural context. And then lastly, I plan to round it all out with a qualitative study, which is really looking at exploring, sorry, my throat is really dry. It's really looking at interviewing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've served a period of incarceration and getting to talk to them and to hear their experiences from there. So this is just an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So broadly speaking, the problem that I've already kind of alluded to a little bit really is that overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. On the right-hand side of the screen here, you can see a graph which looks at a comparison between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's imprisonment rates in comparison to non-Indigenous imprisonment rates dating back to 2010. And this has been a long-standing issue in Australia for a number of years, but this is just a snapshot of that. As it sort of currently stands, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people constitute 3.2% of Australia's total population. But when we look at imprisonment rates, they make up 30% of Australia's total people incarcerated. So when we talk about this issue, we really see that Indigenous people are, their over-incarceration is very cyclic in nature. They grow up seeing their parents, brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, and cousins, many involved in the justice system, thereby normalizing it for them, and then the cycle continues. There are several things that really cause that overrepresentation though, many of which are listed up on the screen. The cause that I'm focusing on is that systemic prejudice and racism. It's really crucial that we work to understand these types of attitudes and how they impact punishment in this country, because public attitudes, the attitudes of you and I, really impact the creation of public policies. So before I jump into my paper too much, I wanted to just be able to really highlight some key definitions for you all that will help when we're talking about the results that I found. When we're talking about punitive attitudes, so they determine if an individual is more or less likely to endorse a certain type of punishment. People that have high punitive attitudes typically prefer harsher sentences. So that's things like prison. People that have low punitive attitudes in comparison often prefer things such as rehabilitation for offenders. When we move on and look at prejudice, so many of us know what prejudice is. It's this irrational tendency to favour one social group over another and to negatively feel towards a person based solely on their race. When we're talking about racial prejudice, it's really that distinction and exclusion based on someone's race, their colour, and their ethnic descent. What this paper will look at is really how these two types of attitudes, how they intermix and what that means for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander offenders in this country. The last definition on the screen, racial essentialism, is something that is very important for the results, so keep it in the back of your mind. But just to explain it a bit, people with racially essentialist views tend to view race as this deep-seated, inalterable essence that all members of a group share set characteristics with one another. So a good example of that might be people that see, for example, we all know the stereotype where someone that is Muslim in faith, a lot of people link that with like terrorism. That is a racially essentialist view because we know that that's not correct. When we're looking at research that's in this space, so research has shown that Australians hold negative attitudes towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people broadly. That same research has also shown that Australians present with highly punitive attitudes, meaning that prison and those harsher types of sentences is really the preferred approach to dealing with offending. Some interesting research from the United States actually compared the level of prejudice and the type of prejudice that the general public presented with, and compared that to that of Australia. And the findings showed that Americans have a very specific type of prejudice, whereas Australians, their prejudice is much more generalised. They simply, in very blunt terms, don't like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which is really terrible to say. This often then culminates with punishment and can lead to harsher sentences for our people. This idea then really links in with one known as penal populism. So what this idea is, it's this us versus them approach to crime, which sees offenders as solely responsible for their behaviour rather than taking into account wider contextual factors such as things like poverty or low education, substance use, those types of things. So the rationale for my study, there was two reasons why I wanted to do this study. So the first study of my PhD really looked at punitive attitudes broadly and its predictors. And I'll show you what those are on the next slide. But we found that the main predictors of punitive attitudes were internal attributions of crime, which is the tendency to believe that crime is that sole responsibility of the offender. Perceptions of crime, interpersonal trust, political ideology, and racial essentialism. The second reason I wanted to do this study was really because, as I showed before, given the nature of incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, exploring whether race really does play a factor in this bigger picture I thought was a really worthwhile exploration when we're talking about this social justice issue. And so my study focused on three research questions. So the first one was, what are the general attitudes towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? What are punitive attitudes influenced by race-based attitudes in Australia? And are there any differences between the type of sentence chosen for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in comparison to a non-Indigenous offender? This last question was explored through a vignette experiment, which I'll talk about in just a second as well. So my methodology was very two-pronged. So I did a survey and I surveyed all of these factors on the left-hand side here. So these were all the questions I used come from validated scales, and all were previously found to be related to punitive attitudes by previous literature. On the right-hand side, when I did my vignette experiment, so respondents were randomly assigned one of two vignettes. Each vignette detailed an offender, their name, their age, their race, and their offence. And all variables were the exact same except for whether that person was listed as being an Aboriginal Australian or a Caucasian Australian. Respondents were then asked to suggest a type of punishment for that offender, be that prison, community service, a fine, a suspended sentence, or something else. And then of those people who selected prison, they were then asked to suggest what they thought might be an appropriate sentence length for that person. So when we're talking about the results, so in regards to that first question, what were the general attitudes? Our findings showed that respondents presented with negative attitudes towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that those presenting with those negative attitudes also presented with higher punitive attitudes. This was consistent with previous research done as well, which, while being horrible, is a good thing for the validity of the study. The second question was looking at, are punitive attitudes influenced by race-based attitudes? The first model that I looked at really only controlled for demographic variables and explored the difference between race-based attitudes and how well that they could predict punitive attitudes. That come out at about 30%. And so basically what that means is 30% of people's punitive attitudes, whether they were low or high in those, were based on race-based factors and where they scored. The second model, though, shared that those same variables, but what I did was controlled for the other factors that I showed on this screen here. And so what that basically meant was, from there, in aggregate, these factors had 52% predictive power, which is quite good. When we looked at race in this model exclusively, they dropped from 30% to 3%. And what that basically meant was that when these factors combine as they do in everyday life, we're able to predict about half of punitive attitudes. So there's still some of the piece of the puzzle that's not quite known yet. The other thing that's really important with this model, where race has dropped to that 3% of exploratory power, is that it shows that it's still a significant piece of the puzzle, but not as much as first thought. Just moving on lastly to that vignette analysis that I talked about in that experiment. So the analysis of the vignettes showed that there was no significant difference between the type of sentence that respondents preferred for either offender, regardless of their race, which is very interesting. And also of note here, we found that racial essentialism moderated the relationship between punitive attitudes and race-based factors. And what that basically means is that those individuals that were low in racial essentialism preferred those more lenient sentences for Aboriginal offenders, whereas individuals with high racial essentialism prefer those harsher punishments. So what does that all mean? Well, what are we talking about now? So what we're looking at is these findings are extremely significant because firstly, we had a representative sample of Australia's population. So we had 530 people complete the survey. All our measures came from validated scales, which is very important, and our findings were consistent with previous research. The most interesting part of this is where I was talking before about how public attitudes really dictate public policy. So if we go back to that idea of what racial essentialism actually is, if members of the public hold these racially essentialist views, which are often based on very little accurate information and formed by misconceptions, rather than actual fact, what we see is they're completely inaccurate. What we know about racially essentialist views is that these are developed more through sociocultural learning, such as from our friends, our family, our peers, our schools, and the media. So for me, when I was thinking about what does this all kind of mean, the way that I see forward in this space is that widespread education is really important. Education on a couple of different areas. So the nature of race and its link to criminality or lack thereof in this context, perceptions around Aboriginal people, and actually working to better that public image, and perceptions of crime as well, because research has shown that people's perceptions are very inaccurate. These findings then, once we tackle that idea of education and social education, they have very important implications for policy making, and which hopefully in time will work towards reducing the over-incarceration of Indigenous Australians in this country. That is my presentation, so thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to talk further about my research, my contact details are on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along, and thank you very much, Caitlin. It's